She sat at the dining table, her back straight, eyes twinkling with a mix of defiance and excitement as she poured wine into 2 glasses. Across from her, he leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips, savoring the forbidden thrill of their clandestine meeting. They had grown bolder, reckless even, indulging in the fantasy that they could carry on like this forever, without consequences. But then, just as she lifted the glass to her lips, she saw it, an envelope, neatly placed in the center of the table, stark and white against the dark mahogany. The words, "divorce papers," were stamped across it, as if taunting her. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath hitched. The color drained from her face as she fumbled to open the envelope, fingers trembling. She could barely comprehend the words as they blurred before her eyes, but the message was clear: this was the end. Panic surged through her veins, and she reached for her phone, dialing the familiar number with shaking hands. The line rang, but each passing second felt like a lifetime. When he finally answered, his voice was cold, detached, so different from the man she thought she knew. "It's over," he said, his words like a knife cutting through the silence. "I've already made my decision. There's no turning back." She tried to protest, to explain, to beg for one more chance. "Please, just let me explain." "It's not what you think, save it," he interrupted, his tone as icy as the wind that blew through Boston streets that evening. "I know everything." For months, she thought she had been careful, meticulous in hiding her affair, planning every rendezvous, every stolen moment. But she underestimated him. She thought she could manage the deceit, but there he was, one step ahead, already orchestrating the end of their marriage, and she never saw it coming. As she clung to the phone, her mind raced, scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. But he had already anticipated every excuse, every lie she might try to spin. And then, the final blow came, quiet but devastating. "You need to move out," he said, calmly, almost casually. "I sold the house." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" she whispered, barely able to breathe. What did you do?" "Everything you own is already packed. By tomorrow, I expect you gone." She couldn't process it. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She was the one who had always been in control, who made the decisions, who kept the secrets. And now, the reality was unraveling before her eyes, faster than she could stop it. The realization struck her: he had been planning this for weeks, maybe even months. While she was slipping out of the office to meet her lover, he was setting the stage for her downfall, ensuring that when the truth came out, she would be the one left scrambling in the wreckage. That night, as she sat alone in the now eerily quiet house, she replayed every interaction in her mind, trying to pinpoint when it all went wrong. When had he found out? How long had he known? And why hadn't he confronted her sooner? The questions swirled, but there were no answers, only the deafening silence of a life that was no longer hers to control. She never imagined he would act so decisively, so ruthlessly. The man she once thought she could deceive had turned out to be a formidable adversary, more cunning and calculating than she could have ever imagined. But the truth was, it didn't start with those divorce papers. It started much earlier, with little hints she had ignored: his sudden late-night calls, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the quiet, knowing smile he wore the night she said she had to stay late at the office. She had brushed it off, convinced herself it was nothing, that she was still the one holding all the cards. Now, as she stood on the precipice of losing everything, she realized just how wrong she had been. She could still hear his voice, echoing in her head, mocking her attempts to deny the inevitable. "You thought I didn't know? You thought I wouldn't find out?" There was a bitterness to his words, but also a grim satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment, savoring it. What she didn't know was that he had seen through her lies long before she ever started weaving them. He had felt the distance growing between them, sensed the shift in her gaze, the way she lingered a little too long on her phone, or how her excuses became more and more flimsy. And instead of confronting her, he chose to wait, to plan. Because in his mind, confronting her would have been too easy, too predictable. No, he wanted something more. He wanted to take back control in a way that she would never see coming. And so, he began the quiet, deliberate process of dismantling the life they had built together, piece by piece. Selling the house was just the beginning. He wanted her to feel the loss, the way he had felt it when he realized she had betrayed him. He wanted her to understand what it meant to be blindsided, to have the ground ripped out from under her feet without warning. He wasn't just ending their marriage, he was making a statement, one that would echo long after the papers were signed. As she sat there, trying to make sense of it all, she was overwhelmed by a sense of dread, a sinking realization that the man she had thought was weak, naive, was anything but. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. The lover she had risked everything for was nowhere to be found, and she was left alone, facing the consequences of her actions. She picked up the phone again, desperate to find some way to fix this, to plead, to bargain. But deep down, she knew it was over. He wasn't going to listen. He had already made up his mind, and there was nothing she could say to change it. Still, she dialed his number, and when he answered, there was a finality in his voice that sent chills down her spine. "Why?" she whispered, barely able to hold back the tears. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you left me no choice," he replied. "You made your decisions, and now I'm making mine." The call ended, but the questions lingered. What would she do now? How could she possibly start over after losing everything she had thought was secure? And, most haunting of all, how long had he been planning this? The realization that he had been quietly setting her up, all the while acting as if nothing was wrong, was almost too much to bear. The betrayal she had inflicted on him was now being mirrored back at her, but with a precision that was almost surgical, cold, and exacting. He had known all along, and now, as the reality of her situation began to sink in, she was left to wonder just how much further his plan would go. Had he truly thought of everything? Was there another twist waiting, another layer to this nightmare that she had yet to uncover? She stared at the empty glass in her hand, feeling the weight of what was about to come crashing down on her. She had always thought she was the one pulling the strings, the one in control. But now, as the night closed in, it was clear, she had been wrong. Very wrong. Welcome to the channel, where we stand firmly against all forms of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but their message is real. Infidelity destroys lives, trust, and everything once thought unbreakable. So, get ready, because what you're about to experience is a shocking tale of love, deceit, and the devastating fallout of betrayal. Enjoy the story, and prepare yourself for a ride you won't forget. Mark Thompson stood by the large window in his office, watching the city lights flicker like tiny stars. It was late, the kind of quiet hour when the world slowed down, giving space for thoughts to creep in. But tonight, Mark's mind wasn't wandering. It was focused, sharp, as if everything he had been ignoring for months had suddenly snapped into clarity. He was a man who had built his life on order, his career, his marriage, everything followed a careful, deliberate pattern. He'd always been meticulous, maybe even too much so, but it had worked for him. At least, that's what he thought. His wife, Emily, was the opposite in many ways. Where Mark thrived on predictability, Emily craved spontaneity. She was vibrant, with a laugh that could fill a room and a presence that demanded attention. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her all those years ago. They had met at a party, a casual gathering where she'd been the one who talked too loud, laughed too freely. Mark had been drawn to that light, like a moth to a flame, and before he knew it, they were inseparable. She brought color to his otherwise monochromatic world, and for years, it seemed like a perfect balance. Their home was a reflection of this dynamic, a blend of his sleek, minimalistic taste and her love for bold, eclectic decor. In every room, you could see the merging of their worlds, a neat stack of books next to a wild burst of flowers, a clean, polished table offset by a collection of mismatched chairs. It was a house that felt lived in, full of warmth and history, a place that told their story. For anyone who saw them together, it would have seemed like they had it all. Mark, the dedicated professional, rising through the ranks of his law firm with a steady, determined pace; Emily, the lively art curator who brought passion to everything she touched. Together, they had built a life that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Their friends often envied them, the couple that still seemed to find joy in each other's company, who could still make each other laugh even after years of being together. But even the strongest foundations can have cracks, and it's not always easy to see them. For Mark, those cracks began to show in the little things. Emily's late nights at work had become more frequent, her excuses less convincing. She would say she was caught up with an exhibit, or there was a last-minute meeting, but Mark could sense something was off. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to see the signs that she was pulling away, but they were there, as clear as day, if he just allowed himself to look. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside, choosing to believe in the woman he had loved for so long. After all, they had built a life together, a life that meant everything to him. It was easier to accept her explanations than to confront the uncomfortable possibility that something might be wrong. Besides, Mark wasn't the kind of man who made accusations without proof. He was rational, calm, he needed facts, not just a feeling in his gut. Emily, on the other hand, had a way of masking her emotions. She was always so full of life, so present in every moment, that it was easy to overlook the subtle changes. But there were moments, brief flashes, when her eyes would dim, and Mark would catch a glimpse of something he didn't recognize. It was as if she was somewhere else entirely, lost in a thought she couldn't share. He noticed it, but he didn't press. Maybe he didn't want to know what was behind that distant gaze. Their evenings together had changed, too. Where once they would sit and talk for hours, now there was a silence that stretched between them. It wasn't a harsh, cold silence, but a heavy, lingering one that spoke of things unsaid. Emily would sit with her phone, scrolling through messages, while Mark pretended not to notice, burying himself in work or a book. They still shared the same space, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before, a quiet, creeping tension that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Mark thought about it often, late at night when the city was asleep, and he was left alone with his thoughts. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when things had started to shift. Was it something he had done? Or maybe something he hadn't done? He thought back to the early days of their relationship, to the nights they spent talking until the sun came up, to the way she used to look at him, with a kind of wonder, as if he was the only person in the world who mattered. He missed that look. He missed the way she used to curl up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder, as if she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. But now, even when she was there, she felt a million miles away. He could feel her slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. So he did what he always did, he focused on what he could control. He threw himself into his work, taking on extra cases, staying late at the office, convincing himself that if he just worked hard enough, everything would fall back into place. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the nagging feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. Emily, meanwhile, was battling her own demons. She hadn't meant for things to get so complicated. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage everything, to keep her life in perfect balance. But somewhere along the way, that balance had tipped, and she found herself caught in a situation she never anticipated. She loved Mark, or at least she thought she did. But there were days when she felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a life that wasn't hers. She craved freedom, excitement, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. And that craving had led her down a path she never expected to take. She told herself it was just a phase, a momentary lapse, something she could control. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a way of escaping, of finding a piece of herself that she felt she had lost. She didn't want to hurt Mark, but she was hurting herself, and she didn't know how to stop. The house, once a symbol of their love, had become a place filled with ghosts, echoes of laughter that no longer felt real, memories of a happiness that seemed to belong to another time. Mark would walk through the rooms, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if he was a stranger in his own home. He wanted to reach out to her, to fix whatever was broken, but he didn't know where to begin. Every time he tried, the words seemed to catch in his throat, and he would end up saying nothing at all. They were two people living parallel lives, connected but separate, bound by a past that no longer felt like a shared future. And yet, there was still a part of him that hoped, that believed they could find their way back to each other. He just needed to figure out how. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that hope began to fade. He could feel the distance growing, could sense that there was something she wasn't telling him. And it was in those quiet moments, when the world was still, that he would find himself wondering how much longer they could keep pretending that everything was okay. Mark didn't know it then, but he was standing on the edge of a revelation, one that would shatter the carefully constructed world he had built, and force him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. And once the truth came out, there would be no going back. Mark had always been good at reading between the lines, a skill that served him well in his work as a lawyer. But when it came to Emily, he had chosen to overlook the small, subtle signs. Maybe it was denial, or maybe it was hope, but he kept convincing himself that everything would be fine. He had no proof, no solid reason to confront her. Yet, the unease grew, creeping into his thoughts, making it impossible to ignore. It was as if he was watching the final moments of something he couldn't save, but he was still too afraid to reach out and stop it. He started paying closer attention, listening for the changes in her tone, watching her eyes when she spoke. There were nights she would come home later than usual, and though she would smile and kiss him hello, there was a distance in her eyes, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. When he asked how her day was, her answers seemed rehearsed, like lines from a script she had memorized too well. She would laugh it off, change the subject, and Mark would let it slide, even as it gnawed at him. One Friday evening, Mark had planned a surprise dinner at the little Italian restaurant where they used to go when they first started dating. He thought it might bring back a piece of what they had lost, a way to reconnect, even if just for a night. He called her office, hoping to catch her before she left, but the call went straight to voicemail. It was odd, she always answered, even if just to say she'd call back later. He decided to head over to the restaurant, thinking she might already be there, waiting for him. But when he arrived, the familiar warmth of the place felt cold. The waiter recognized him, smiled, and led him to a table near the back, but there was no sign of Emily. Mark checked his phone, trying to ignore the anxiety building in his chest. He sent her a quick message, a simple, "Where are you?" but there was no reply. An hour passed, and the waiter began to give him pitying glances. Mark tried to smile, to act like it was all fine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he finally decided to leave, he felt a strange sense of dread, as if he was walking towards a truth he didn't want to discover. The drive back home felt longer than usual, the city lights blurring through the car window as he tried to make sense of the thoughts swirling in his mind. He pulled into the driveway, noticing that Emily's car wasn't there. For a moment, he wondered if she had gotten caught up with friends or stayed late at work, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. He waited, sitting in the dark, the silence of the house around him heavy and suffocating. Around midnight, her car finally pulled up. He watched as she stepped out, her movements hurried, like someone who didn't want to be seen. She opened the front door, and when she saw him sitting there, her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, before she composed herself and forced a smile. "You're still up," she said, her voice light, casual, but there was a nervous edge to it. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." "I went to the restaurant," he said, his tone flat. "You weren't there." For a moment, there was a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, walking over to him, "I completely forgot we had plans. Work got hectic, and then I ran into an old friend, and I lost track of time." Mark nodded, but he could feel the lie, like a bitter taste on his tongue. He wanted to ask more, to press her, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching her, as if trying to see past the facade she was putting up. The next morning, Mark decided he couldn't just wait anymore. He needed to know. He needed to find the truth, even if it shattered everything. So, he started with something simple. He checked their shared calendar, her emails, her messages. He felt a pang of guilt, invading her privacy, but the need to understand outweighed everything else. And then he found it, a message that wasn't meant for him, buried among dozens of others. It was a text, short and to the point, from a number he didn't recognize. "Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again." Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He read the message over and over, as if the words might change, as if he might find some hidden meaning that would make it all okay. But there was no other meaning. It was exactly what it seemed. He felt a surge of emotions, anger, hurt, disbelief, but more than anything, there was a deep, aching sadness. It was like he was watching everything he thought he knew crumble before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but at the same time, he was terrified of what she might say. For the next few days, he tried to act normal, even as he felt like he was slowly unraveling. He watched her, listened to the way she spoke, the way she moved, looking for any sign that would confirm or deny what he had seen. But everything she did felt like a performance, a carefully constructed act, and Mark was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. And then, one evening, he got the confirmation he was dreading. Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter, and as she went upstairs to shower, it buzzed with a new message. Mark glanced at the screen, and there it was, a name he hadn't seen before, but that now felt all too familiar. He hesitated, his heart pounding, but then he picked up the phone and read the message. It was simple, a casual, affectionate note, like something a lover would send. "I'm thinking about you. Can't wait to be in your arms again." Mark felt like the air had been knocked out of him. The room spun, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. But he didn't. He just stood there, numb, as the realization washed over him. This was it. The truth, laid out before him, undeniable, unchangeable. He had been right all along, but he wished more than anything that he had been wrong. When Emily came back downstairs, she saw him holding her phone, and the color drained from her face. There was a moment of silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch forever, before she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark. I can explain." But he didn't want to hear it. The words felt hollow, meaningless. He put the phone down, his hands steady now, his mind clearer than it had been in days. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear in her eyes, the guilt, the regret. "I don't need you to explain," he said quietly, his voice calm, but firm. "I already know." Emily opened her mouth, as if to protest, but then she stopped, her shoulders sagging, as if she had been carrying a weight too heavy to bear. She knew there was no point in lying anymore, no point in pretending. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. But even as Mark turned to leave, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, how long had she been deceiving him? How much of their life together had been a lie? And what would come next, now that the fragile illusion had been shattered? As he walked out of the room, the questions lingered, unanswered, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. Mark sat in his lawyer's office, the documents spread out in front of him. The morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the polished wood desk. He had spent hours reading and rereading the divorce papers, each word feeling like another small cut, another reminder of what had been lost. It was a strange feeling, sitting there, making the end of his marriage official, yet a part of him felt almost relieved. The decision was no longer hanging over him, it had been made. The weight he had been carrying for weeks was finally starting to lift, even if only slightly. But the relief was brief. As Mark was about to sign, his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, cleared her throat. "Before you finalize this, I think there's something you should see." She slid a small envelope across the desk, her expression unreadable. It's from the buyer of the house. Mark frowned, confused. The house is sold. What else could there be to discuss? Rachel hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Yes, it's sold. But the buyer's name, well, it's important that you see it yourself. Mark's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the paper, and then he saw it, the name that made his blood run cold. It was Emily. She was the buyer. The house, their home, had been sold, but not to a stranger. She had bought it. Mark stared at the name, trying to make sense of it, but the words seemed to blur together. Why would she do this? What was she planning? Rachel watched him closely. Mark, it seems she was trying to buy it back, under a different account, possibly to keep it hidden from you. But the sale was processed before I received the full details. Mark's mind raced. This was supposed to be his way of cutting ties, of moving on. But now it felt like he was caught in another one of her manipulations, another twisted game he didn't understand. She wanted the house, he muttered, mostly to himself. Why? Later that evening, Mark sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes. Emily had promised to come by to collect her things, and he wanted to be out of the house before she arrived. He didn't trust himself to face her without losing control. But as the evening dragged on, and she didn't show up, his phone buzzed with a message, "Can we talk? Please." Against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, a place they hadn't been to in years, but once had been a favorite. It was almost empty, save for a few people scattered around, absorbed in their own lives. Emily was already there, sitting at a table by the window. When she saw him, she smiled, a sad, hesitant smile, like someone who knew the battle was already lost. Mark didn't smile back. He sat down, keeping his distance, and waited for her to speak. "I didn't know how to explain this to you," she began, her voice barely audible. "But I need you to understand why I did what I did." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "I didn't want to lose everything. I thought, if I bought the house, we could. I don't know, find a way to fix this." "Fix this?" Mark's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. "There is no fixing this, Emily. You cheated, you lied, and now you're trying to buy our house behind my back. What exactly are you trying to do here?" "I was trying to hold on to something," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Something that felt like it could still be saved." Mark's hands clenched into fists, the frustration boiling over. "You don't get to do that, Emily. You don't get to destroy everything and then act like you're the one trying to make things right." "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "But there's more to this than you think." For a moment, the anger faded, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" She looked down, twisting her hands together, a habit she had whenever she was nervous. "The house. I didn't just buy it for me. I bought it for us. For our future." The words hung in the air, strange and out of place. Mark shook his head, trying to understand. "What future?" "Emily, there is no us anymore. We're done." "But I was trying to fix my mistakes," she insisted, her voice growing more desperate. "I know I betrayed you, but it was never supposed to be this way." "I was." Mark leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You were what? Trying to manipulate me into staying? Into forgiving you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "No, that's not it. I was trying to buy back what I lost, because I was never supposed to be the one who lost it." There was a long silence as Mark processed her words. "I don't understand." And then, she said the words that changed everything. "I found out that the house was going to be sold to someone else, someone who wasn't you. You sold it, Mark, but it wasn't just to get away from me. You were leaving everything behind, including your job, your life here, everything. Mark's heart stopped. What are you talking about? I sold the house because I didn't want to live in a place where everything fell apart. No, she said, shaking her head. You sold it because you were planning to disappear. I saw the paperwork, Mark. I know about the account you opened, the money you've been withdrawing. You were going to leave me, and you didn't even have the guts to tell me to my face. Mark's mouth went dry. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was the one with the upper hand, the one who was finally taking control, but now he felt exposed, as if she had pulled back a curtain he didn't even realize was there. I wasn't disappearing, he said, but even as he spoke, he realized how hollow the word sounded. Then why the secret account? She pressed, her voice rising. Why did you sell everything and plan to leave without telling me? Mark's mind was spinning, trying to find a way to explain, but there was nothing he could say that would make it all make sense. Because the truth was, she was right. He had been planning to leave, to start over somewhere far away, where no one knew his name or his past. It was supposed to be his escape, his way of erasing everything that had gone wrong. But he hadn't expected her to find out. And now, as he sat across from her, he could see that she wasn't just the villain of this story. She was desperate, clinging to something she thought she could still save, even as it slipped through her fingers. I didn't want you to find out like this, he said finally, his voice low. I was going to leave, yes. But it wasn't because of you. She let out a bitter laugh. Wasn't because of me. Mark, everything about this is because of us. Because you couldn't face the truth, and I couldn't admit what I had done. We're both to blame for this mess. Mark looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the fear beneath the anger, the sadness beneath the defiance. She was fighting to hold on to something that was already gone, and he was fighting to escape a life that no longer felt like his. They were two people, caught in a spiral of their own making, and there was no easy way out. I thought leaving would make it easier, he said quietly. I thought if I just disappeared, I wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. But I see now, that was a mistake. Emily's eyes softened, and for a moment, Mark saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman who had once been his everything. Then don't leave, she whispered. Stay. Let's figure this out together. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that it was possible to fix everything, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The damage had been done, and no amount of promises could erase the past. And then, just as he was about to respond, she said something that made his heart stop. I bought the house because I was afraid you'd leave without telling me why. I thought if I owned it, you'd have to talk to me, and maybe I could still change your mind. Mark stared at her, realizing just how far she had been willing to go to keep him. It wasn't just about the house, or the affair, or even the lies. It was about the fear of losing him, the fear of facing the world without the man she had built her life around. And in that moment, he understood that the game they were playing was about so much more than betrayal. It was about control, desperation, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they could still find a way back to each other. But the truth was, no matter how much she wanted to change his mind, the decision had already been made. And as he looked at her, he knew that this would be their last conversation in the home they once shared. The drive back from the cafe was quiet, almost unbearably so. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as if holding on for dear life. The conversation with Emily replayed in his mind, over and over, like a broken record. She had tried to reach him, tried to explain, but the more she talked, the more he felt the ground slipping out from under him. It wasn't just the betrayal, or the lies, or even the fact that she had tried to buy the house behind his back. It was the realization that, for so long, they had both been pretending, clinging to the illusion that things could be fixed, when in reality, they were broken beyond repair. When he reached the house, he didn't go inside right away. He sat in the car, staring at the front door, the familiar shape of it now feeling foreign, almost hostile. This was supposed to be their home, a place of comfort and safety. But now, it felt like a battleground, filled with memories that had turned into ghosts. He could still picture the way she had looked at him that evening, her eyes pleading, her voice trembling with desperation. "Then don't leave. Stay. Let's figure this out together." But what was there left to figure out? She had made her choices, and he had made his. Yet, as he sat there, he couldn't help but feel that nagging pull, that tiny flicker of doubt. What if he was wrong? What if there was still a way to salvage this, to find a way back to what they used to be? The thought scared him, more than anything else, because it meant confronting a part of himself he had been trying to run from, the part that still loved her, despite everything. Mark finally got out of the car and walked towards the house, his footsteps heavy, as if each step was a struggle. When he opened the door, the familiar scent of home hit him, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed by a wave of nostalgia. It was a cruel reminder of what he was losing, of the life that was slipping away. He moved through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of their shared past, photographs, trinkets, little pieces of a life they had built together. And yet, all he could see now were the cracks, the fractures that had been there all along, hidden just beneath the surface. As he was packing a few last things, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw it was a message from Emily, "I'm coming over. We need to talk." Mark's heart sank. He didn't want another conversation, another round of pleading and apologies. But he knew she wouldn't stop until she had said everything she needed to say. So, he waited. When she arrived, there was no pretense of calm. She looked disheveled, her eyes red from crying, as if she had spent the last few hours in a battle with herself. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I was wrong to try and manipulate you, to make you stay when you wanted to leave. I don't know how to let go." He wanted to tell her that it was too late, that the time for apologies had passed. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in weeks. She sat down, and for a long moment, they were silent, two people who had once been everything to each other, now struggling to find the right words. "I don't know how we got here," she continued, her voice breaking. "I thought I could fix it, that if I just held on tight enough, we'd find our way back. But I've only made things worse. I see that now." Mark didn't respond. He didn't know how to. There was a part of him that wanted to forgive her, to tell her that they could start over, but there was also a part of him that knew it would never be the same. Trust, once broken, doesn't simply mend. It lingers, like a scar, a constant reminder of what was lost. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching for something, hope, forgiveness, maybe even just acknowledgement. "Do you remember when we bought this house?" she asked, her voice soft, as if she was afraid of shattering the fragile calm between them. "We stood in the empty living room, and you said, 'This is where we'll build our future.' I held on to that, even when everything else was falling apart." Mark felt a pang in his chest. He did remember. It was one of the happiest days of his life, a day full of promise and dreams. But now, those dreams felt like a cruel joke. "I meant it," he said quietly. "But things change, Emily. People change." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know. But I'm scared, Mark. I'm scared of what happens when you leave, of what's left when there's no us anymore." The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. It was the first time she had said it out loud, and it felt like a confession, as if she was finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. Mark's heart ached, but he couldn't give her the answer she wanted. "I'm scared too," he said. "But I can't keep pretending. We can't keep pretending." They sat there, the silence between them more powerful than any words. It was a silence filled with all the things they had left unsaid, the regrets and the what-ifs. For a moment, it felt like they were back at the beginning, two people who had just met, trying to figure out where they fit in each other's lives. But this wasn't the beginning. It was the end, and there was no escaping that. As the evening wore on, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. "I wrote this, weeks ago. Before I knew about the sale. I was going to give it to you, but I was too scared." She handed it to him, her hands shaking. "I want you to read it." Mark hesitated, then took the envelope, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Inside was a letter, written in her familiar, flowing script. It was a letter of apology, but also a confession, a raw and unfiltered outpouring of everything she had been too afraid to say. She wrote about her fear of losing him, of feeling like she wasn't enough, and how that fear had driven her to make choices she regretted. But the most painful part was at the end, where she admitted something that took his breath away. "I bought the house because I thought, if I owned it, maybe I could convince you to stay. Maybe I could remind you of what we used to have, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back. But I see now that it was wrong. I see that I can't force you to love me, to forgive me. And if you need to leave, I'll let you go. I just hope you'll find happiness, even if it's not with me." Mark folded the letter, his hands shaking. He looked up at her, and for the first time in a long while, he saw her, not the woman who had betrayed him, but the woman he had loved, who was now standing before him, broken and afraid. He could feel the tears welling up, but he fought them back, determined not to let his emotions cloud his judgment. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you just say all of this before?" "Because I was scared," she said, her voice cracking. "I was scared of losing you, of losing everything. And I thought, if I could just hold on, maybe you wouldn't see how broken I was." Mark felt his heart twist. He wanted to be angry, to lash out, but he couldn't. Because as much as she had hurt him, he could see now that she had been hurting too. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, "I don't know if we can fix this. But I know that running away won't solve anything." She looked up, her eyes filled with a fragile hope. "So, what does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that I'm not leaving tonight. We need to figure out what happens next, and we can't do that if we're running from each other." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a promise of reconciliation. But it was a start, a way to begin the painful, difficult process of untangling the mess they had made. And as they sat there, in the quiet of the house they had once called home, they both knew that whatever happened next, it would be a step forward, even if it meant walking away. In the weeks that followed their last conversation, the air between Mark and Emily was tense, charged with a fragile hope that neither of them wanted to admit was there. They continued to live in the same house, their routines still intertwined, but there was an unspoken understanding that things were different now. Mark wasn't rushing to leave, and Emily had stopped trying to hold on too tightly. It was as if they were living in a delicate truce, each step they took a careful negotiation. But the calm wouldn't last forever. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table, Emily's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, her expression immediately darkening. Mark saw her hesitation and the way her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone. "It's him," she said quietly, not meeting Mark's eyes. Mark felt a familiar wave of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down, keeping his voice steady. "What does he want?" "He's been calling and texting. He wants to see me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's saying he made a mistake, that he wants me back." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Mark felt a cold, bitter satisfaction, but also a sadness that he couldn't quite explain. He looked at Emily, and for the first time, he didn't see her as the woman who had betrayed him, but as someone who was lost, caught in a web she couldn't untangle. "And what do you want?" he asked, his tone softer than he intended. "I don't know," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought I wanted to fix things with you, but now, everything is so broken. I'm broken. And I don't know how to fix it. Mark nodded, understanding. He had felt the same way for so long, but now he realized that fixing it wasn't the point. Maybe some things weren't meant to be fixed. Emily, he said, choosing his words carefully, sometimes, trying to hold on to something that's already gone only makes it worse. Maybe, it's time we both let go. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to say it. You're saying we should end this? For good? Yes, he said, feeling a strange sense of peace as he spoke. I think it's the only way we can both move on. You need to find out who you are without me, and I need to do the same. The finality of his words hit her like a blow, and for a moment, she struggled to breathe. But then she realized he was right. She had spent so long trying to cling to something that had already slipped through her fingers, and in doing so, she had lost herself. I don't want to keep hurting you, she said, her voice breaking. I don't want to keep hurting myself. Mark reached across the table and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Then don't. Let's stop pretending this can work. Let's end it on our terms, with some dignity, before we destroy everything we ever had. The decision was made, and it was final. In the days that followed, they began the painful process of separating their lives. The house was sold, but this time, there were no secrets. They split the proceeds, and Mark helped Emily find a new place to live. It was a small apartment, not far from where they had once lived together, but it felt like a different world. For Emily, it was a fresh start, a chance to build something new, even if she had to do it alone. On the day Mark was set to move out, he found Emily standing in the empty living room, staring at the walls as if she was seeing them for the first time. She turned when she heard him, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, neither of them saying a word. Finally, she spoke. I'm scared, Mark. I don't know how to do this. I know, he said softly. But you will. And so will I. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time, she didn't try to hide them. I wish things had been different, she whispered. I wish I had been different. So do I, he replied. But wishing won't change what happened. We just have to find a way to live with it. As he walked out of the house for the last time, Mark felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a quiet sense of closure. He had spent so long trying to figure out how to fix things, but now he realized that the only way to truly heal was to let go. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. Emily, too, found herself standing at a crossroads. She had made mistakes, hurt the person she loved most, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. But as painful as it was, there was a part of her that was grateful. Grateful for the chance to start over, to find out who she was without the weight of the past dragging her down. She would always carry the scars of what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, those scars could teach her something. Months passed, and Mark settled into his new life. He found a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the memories of his old life. He focused on his work, threw himself into new projects, and even started going out with friends again. It wasn't easy, but it was a beginning. One evening, as he was leaving the office, he ran into an old friend who hadn't seen him in years. Mark, you look different, the friend said, a note of surprise in his voice. Lighter, somehow. Mark smiled, and for the first time, it felt genuine. Yeah, he said. I guess I finally let go of some things I should have a long time ago. As for Emily, she found herself in the same cafe where she and Mark had had their final conversation, sipping a cup of coffee and reflecting on everything that had happened. She had reached out to her former lover, but when they met, it was clear that whatever connection they once had was gone. He was apologetic, but distant, and for the first time, she realized that she didn't want to go back to that life. She didn't need to be defined by her mistakes anymore. She had the power to choose a different path, and she intended to do just that. In the end, Mark and Emily's story wasn't one of reconciliation or happy endings. It was a story of two people who had loved each other, who had hurt each other, and who had finally found the strength to let go. They were no longer defined by their past, no longer trapped in a cycle of betrayal and regret. And that, in its own way, was a kind of freedom. As Mark stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city lights, he felt a sense of calm. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He could see the future now, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. And he knew that whatever came next, he would face it head-on, without the weight of the past holding him back. Thank you for listening. What did you think of the story? Do you agree with the choices Mark and Emily made, or would you have done things differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Remember, we do not support any form of betrayal. These stories are meant to show how deceit can destroy lives. Until next time, stay true, stay kind, and thank you for being here.